Please.
You ready?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Okay. I am Aryeh Halivni. I'm sitting here with David Krakow in Teaneck, New Jersey, November 27th, 2017. Thank you very much for agreeing to have Toldot Israel interview you and record your story. Why don't we start at the beginning? Tell me where your parents were born, your grandparents were born. How you know where your family's background is?
Yes. My father was born in Kishinev in Bessarabia, and he was a teenager during the pogrom in 1903. He was a witness to the pogrom because at the time his family had taken refuge in a church during the pogrom, and his mother felt the pogrom lasted 2 days, I believe, and there was family in the city, and his mother wanted to know whether they were safe. And the only one that she chose to go out during the pogrom was my father, because he wore a uniform as a student in a Russian school. So for him, it was an especially memorable event. And
How old was he?
I believe he was probably around 15. I believe so. My mother was born in a shtetl near Trotkov in Galicia. And she came alone to the United States. She had a sister here at the age of, I believe, 13. My father, when he left Europe, he served in the Russian army, I believe, for about 3 years before he went over the hill and he deserted. And he made his way to Canada, where he had a brother. And from Canada, he came to New York. He came to Montreal, I think, in 1909. He came to New York in 1911. And that's where they met. So my father was a bit of an exception in a way, because in those days, as I understand it, the immigrants clustered with relatives in Landslide. And my mother, of course, did with her relatives in Landslide. In Montreal, my father had that. In New York, he didn't. So right away, he was different. And also, most of the immigrants, at least there were immigrants who had received, let's say, a gymnasium education in New York, but not on the Lower East Side. There weren't many who grew up there and lived there. So, and usually they were the labor leaders and the socialists and the intellectuals who ran away from the Russian prisons. But my father didn't fit too well.
Did he have Did they have a traditional Jewish education?
My mother did not have much in the way of education, but she was observant. My father was not a, I shouldn't say he was not a believer, but he was indifferent. But he was a strong Jewish nationalist.
Was his name Krakow?
Originally, no. No, my father's name was Kalman Baruch Krikunets. And his brother had changed it to Krakow in Montreal. So he followed suit. And that created problems because apparently we had relatives in Argentina who couldn't find us for years. But I didn't change my name because I was born with it. Yeah. So that's the family
And they
background.
both did. Your mother, who lived on the Lower East Side?
My mother went to the East Side. That's where she had family. She had relatives. She had a sister. And as I said, my father came down from Montreal. Both married late. My father, I think, was in his mid-30s, maybe even a little older. My mother was probably around 30, 29, 30.
And professionally, what did they do?
My mother was a homemaker, and my father, his brother was working in a factory in Montreal making men's pants. So he brought my father in. My father learned how to do that and hated it. And when he came to New York, he looked for something else to do, so he went out on the street with a pushcart, and he sold ladies' blouses until one day he collapsed and was taken to Gubernia Hospital and was told that he was suffering from malnutrition. He didn't sell enough blouses to eat sufficiently. So it was a choice. Eat, go to work at a pants factory, or, so he went back to it. And eventually he established his own factory. And he had a pants shop on the Lower East Side for many years. And somehow or other he managed to survive the Depression. And when things got good, that is when the war came and things were better, he closed the shop. And the reason he closed the shop is because there was price controls. And the mills where he bought his fabric, they had to be paid more than the invoice showed, which meant he had to do the same thing with his customers. And it scared him. Aside from the fact that he was a very straight guy. Always, I must say. Very honest and very truthful. He closed the shop. He went to the High School of Needle Trades to learn how to cut garments for women's wear, because he didn't want to work in the men's wear. He was embarrassed. He closed the shop. And he went to work in a factory making women's garments. The last 15 years of his life, he was blind. He had glaucoma, which was unattended because this was a man who, except for emergencies, didn't go to doctors. So they didn't catch it in time. And it's a disease which...
Call from cell 09J.
you don't realize that you're losing your sight because you can read. The field of vision narrows, and it narrows imperceptibly, very slowly. So by the time it was diagnosed, they had surgery and he took drops and so on, but he was blind for the last 15 years of his life. He was an interesting guy. Yeah, he lived 88.
Was he a Zionist?
He was not a Zionist. And the reason he was not a Zionist is because he did not believe Jews were capable of governing themselves, believe it or not. He was not a socialist. He was not religious. He was a strong Jewish nationalist. If somebody said he was a Russian, he would deny it. In fact, he was told in Canada by somebody that he was Russian because he was born in Russia. And his answer was, if I was born in a stable, would it make me a horse? You see. But the other thing about him is that he anticipated a great calamity for the Jews. He blamed it on the communists. He was a pessimist, and he actually thought Hitler was going to win the war. And I remember even as a kid trying to persuade him otherwise. But that was my father, yeah.
And when were you born?
1926. In People's Hospital on 2nd Avenue. It doesn't exist anymore. There's the Sirovich Center for the Aged. That's where I was born. Yeah. And I grew up on the East Side. And my father lived after my mother passed away. She died at the age of, I thought she was 58 according to her records, but her sister told me she was 60. She had a rheumatic heart, and it was the result of some illness she had as a girl, which impaired her heart. And over time, she had difficulty climbing stairs, and we had to move to a ground floor in a building. And for many years, she was like a semi-invalid, But I wanted to tell you something more, but I don't remember now. What was the question again? Oh, about the East Side?
Yeah, and I'm curious, you're growing up or where you went to school?
I was going to tell you about my dad when he was in the Home for the Blind. He was in the Jewish Guild for the Blind home up in Yonkers. And I used to tell him, because he came, after my mother died, he continued living on the East Side. All the years that he was here in America, he lived on the Lower East Side. He had the shop on the Lower East Side when he had the shop. That's where he lived. So when he was in the home in Yonkers and we used to visit him, I would give him news about the East Side. And I told him, I said, you know, that the Yeshiva Yankov Yosef moved to Riverdale and the Forward moved to Midtown and this and that. And one day, listening to me, he said, you know, he said the American Jews have lost their address. Because to him, the East Side was the address of American Jews, you know, which was a great insight, by the way, because it was true. It was true.
Did you know of somebody named, his nickname was Shabbos Friedman? Does that name ring a bell?
No.
Okay.
No. But I'll tell you a funny story. When we moved from Cannon Street to Ludlow Street, which is another part of the East Side, so my mother had to enroll me in another school and enroll me in another Hebrew school. The Hebrew school I went to, and I started at 4 because my brother was born when I was 4. And I don't know how she managed it, but she got me into kindergarten, which wasn't supposed to be until 5. And she enrolled me at the Bialystock Talmud Torah on Willard Street. So I was accustomed to that kind of Jewish education.
Are you the oldest?
I was the oldest. My brother was 4 years younger. So when we moved to Ludlow Street, she enrolled me at PS 42, a different school. I think I was 6 by then. And in the National Hebrew School on East Broadway, which she didn't realize was not a religious school. It was a, they taught Hebrew as a spoken language. Chomsky's father was the principal over there. And the teachers were not old men with beards. They were women, young women, and they were teaching Hebrew as a spoken language. Unfortunately, I didn't go for it. They had a lot of trouble with me. I was misbehaving. It was a problem. And I don't remember this, but I was told that one day my mother and her sister were questioning me about why I was having so much difficulty in the Hebrew school. And I told them that they weren't teaching me Jewish there, they were teaching me Italian. Because at that time, I knew there was English, I knew there was Jewish, which was Yiddish, which was my first language. I learned English only in kindergarten. And I knew there was Italian because there were Italians around. So when my mother heard that, she took me out of the National Hebrew School and enrolled me in the Yeshiva Mordechai Rosenblatt on Henry Street, which was not a yeshiva, it was a Talmud Torah, but it was like the Bialystock. And I was at home in that environment. And I missed the chance to master Hebrew as a kid.
Wow.
That's the story.
So you're growing up in the Lower East Side, and do you remember? What do you remember from either American politics or world politics? You would have been, when Kristallnacht happened, you would have been still pretty young.
Yeah.
Do you remember any of these?
I remember a lot because of that kind, you know, because most of my father's family remained in Europe. And they were a big family. My father was 2 years old when his father died. He was the youngest of 4 children. except for his brother who went to Montreal as a teenager. He left, he walked out. The others remained there. And my grandmother had remarried and had a lot of kids with her second husband. They were pretty well fixed over there because they had a business selling kerosene, neft, which was brought from the Caucasus. They had servants, they had people working for them. I gather that my uncle and my father, for one reason or another, were not happy there. So that his brother left as a teenager. My father left, as I said, after he served in the army for several years. I only learned in recent years that his oldest brother and his wife and his daughter were murdered by the Germans or the Romanians or both. Anyway, one of the brothers, one of the sons of my father's oldest brother, made it to Argentina. And my son Doran, a few years ago, found him. And again, the irony. Doran was working for what they called it was the umbrella group for the federations. And when he told me he's going to Argentina, I said, look for someone named Krakow or Krikonet, which was the Romanian version, because I know I have a cousin there, David Krakonets. And I had asked other people when they went to Argentina, and I said, I believe he's a jeweler. I believe so. Nobody ever found him. Doran went, he was at the joint, and he told them he's looking for someone by that name. And they started by checking the rolls of the joint, of the people that they're helping there, because they are a charitable organization, the joint. And sure enough, they found Freddie. His father had died. He's a pianist, a very fine pianist. And the reason he was on the rolls of the joint, his house was near the Jewish community center that was bombed. And the house was heavily damaged. And for a time he was having real problems. But from once we found him, I learned about more. What was the fate of my father's brother, his sister, what happened in Kishinev. I just Doran got me, so I'm reading more, and it's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
It's really heartbreaking. I had one cousin in Bogota, Colombia, who was the son of one of my father's half-sisters, the other side of the family, the Edelmans. And his parents brought him to Bogota, to Colombia in the 30s. And he really grew up there. He was an only child, and his father died of a stroke in Bogota. This is a guy who had a tough life in Bogota and was a tough guy. And yet he said to me, in Kishinev, he was always scared, always scared. So that gives you some idea, you know, what kind of place that was, you know. He's since deceased also. So that's the background.
Now, what's your first memory of anybody talking about Palestine or Zionism or?
Okay. In Hebrew school, Mordechai Rosenblatt, we didn't learn very much. And the method of instruction was to read from the Torah, Bereshis in Anfangen, Brot Bashaften, Elohim Gott, word by word translated from, and it would start with the first kid in the first row, and then the second one, and the third one, and the fourth one. We didn't have big classes, but we had maybe 15, 20 kids in the class. It was very boring. And I used to get into trouble as a result. And I wasn't the only one. I feel sorry for the rabbi. If he was a rabbi, I doubt it. And I feel sorry for the kids. Although I have to say that it couldn't have been that bad, you know. But in any case, one day, a young rabbi by the name of Jacob Schreut, and the story about Jacob Schreut is this was a guy who grew up on the East Side. He wasn't much older than we were. He was a kid who caused his parents so much grief that they sent him to a yeshiva in Poland. And he came back from Poland with a wife just before the outbreak of the Second World War. And he was our teacher. And this was a big change. First of all, he was one of us. He grew up on the East Side. As I said, he wasn't much older than we were. And he came fresh from Poland. So he shared with us a lot of information about what Poland was like, what they were going through over there. And he was the one who brought us literature about Palestine, about Zionism. And we went out with the Keren Kayemet boxes on the street to raise money. And in 1943, now 1943, I went there till the age of 14. So I was out already by then. My brother was going, he followed me 4 years later in everything, you know. Aaron Propus, who was Begin's predecessor as the Netziv of the Beitar in Poland, was expelled from Palestine by the British and came to New York about the same time that Jabbo was here. He took over the Beitar here. And I'm going to get into that story in a minute. When the United States entered the war, the Beitarim, who were 18 or over, took off, they joined the army. And what Propus had then was just a summer camp for kids, which was the main source of income for the organization. But he was a very creative guy. This was what he did. He organized in the Madison Square Garden a rally called the Rally of Hope, where the children from all the Jewish Hebrew schools, day schools in the metropolitan area would come to the garden to plead for the saving of the Jewish children of Europe. This was in 1943. And he was able to involve Eddie Cantor and Mayor LaGuardia and so on. But that was all a front, you know. It was Propus and a handful of revisionists in New York who were responsible for it. And by the way, the Madison Square Garden was hounding him and the Beitar for years because the fee had not been fully paid. You know, Rabbi Schroit sent my brother up to 55 West 42nd Street, where the Beitar office was located, the revisionist office too. And Mayor Grossman was in the same building. I don't know if you remember Mayor Grossman.
Who's Mayor Grossman?
Yeah, he was the one who wouldn't leave the World Zionist Organization when Jabo pulled out, and he established the Judenstadtpartei, the Jewish State Party. But that's another story. Anyway, my brother was sent up to Propus's office to get tickets for the kids to go to the Madison Square Garden for this rally. So he met Propus before I did, you see. Now, how did I meet Propus? I was a 16-year-old senior in Seward Park High School. And in the English class, and my teacher was a Mr. Horowitz, who I later found out was a communist and was forced out of the job. I didn't know it at the time. But he gave an assignment to the class to write an essay on a current event. My essay was on the white paper, the British white paper. Whatever I learned from Bergson's ads. You know, in those days, Hillel Cook and Ben Hecht and those guys were putting ads in the papers, you see. This is 1943. So I ended in that paper, and Mr. Horowitz selected 4 papers to be read to the class, and my paper was one of them. So I read my paper to the class. At the end of the class, when we were leaving the room, there was one of my classmates, a girl that I didn't know. I mean, she was a classmate, but I had never spoken to her. She was waiting for me at the door. And she stopped me as I was leaving, and she said to me, "Was this just a composition for you, or did you mean what you said?" I said, "I meant what I said." She said, "You can do something about it." Really. She brought me to my first Beitar meeting at the West Side Institutional Synagogue on the west side of Manhattan. Because there were the people who were not old enough to be in the army. So there were younger Beitarim, and the Beitariyot. And it didn't take me long to realize that we were kindred spirits, that we felt the same way about things.
What was her name?
See, Evelyn Antonoff. Evelyn Antonoff. Her father was was institutionalized. She lived with her mother. She was an only child on Cannon Street, and they were on welfare. And she got to Beitar because of a scholarship to Camp Beitar in the summertime. Her mother must have figured out how to do that. And she became a Beitariya, and a very dedicated one. And of course remained a lifelong friend. But she was the one who brought me in.
When you said you mentioned the ads in the newspaper, what newspaper were they in? All the newspapers, or Jewish papers, or the
No.
Journal?
Believe it or not, my father read the Journal American, Hearst paper. My father, as I said, had a problem with the leftists because he felt that it's going to lead to something bad. And there were too many Jewish leftists, in his opinion. He wasn't arguing on the basis of principles. He was arguing on the basis that they were Jews. And he used to say, if there is a non-Jew among them, he's verblonget. You know, he saw it as a Jewish phenomenon. My father voted for Alf Landon in 1936, not for FDR. Although he voted for FDR in 40.
I was going to ask who he voted for. Okay.
Yeah, he voted for FDR in 40. So I'm sure that his feelings influenced me, you know. I was a kid, and I can remember doing some silly things, like sending a letter to the Daily Worker to ask him how many Jews there were in the Communist Party. They didn't answer me.
Yeah, so you saw these ads in the
newspaper. I mean, at the time, I didn't. Eventually, I got to know these guys. I got to know Cook. I got to know Merlin. I got to know Ben Eliezer and Raffaelli and Ari Jabotinsky and so on. But at that time, of course, I didn't know them. They did a tremendous job, these guys. They did a tremendous job. Although, Netanyahu was here, his father, Ben Zion. And he was the executive director of the revisionist organization in New York. They had their offices also at 55 West 42nd Street. And he used to commute to Philadelphia because he was working for his PhD at Dropsy. And I felt when I got to know him, and I didn't really get to know him personally. I got to know him as the executive director of a revisionist organization, attending lectures by him and so on. I considered him a genius, and the only genius I think I ever met. And he was a brilliant guy. And also a character. And I can remember at one of the meetings, he came in with a handful of people, and he said, before he started the lecture, he said, "The same old faces. I'm sick and tired of the same old faces." He would lose his temper easily. He was rough on his secretary, Rachel Lumenitz, from Norman, Oklahoma. I remember his coming from a meeting with Rabbi Meir Berlin. I won't tell you what he said, but at the same time, he was brilliant in his writings, in his speeches.
He wasn't happy with the meeting with Rav
No,
Meir?
he wasn't. Whatever happened there, I don't know, but something happened. And I'll tell you only one. I brought him down to the Lower East Side. He spoke at the Educational Alliance. Brought him to City College. In fact, at City College, they put up, there was a Beitar group at City College. Misha, Moshe Ahrens, Seymour Rosenberg, Dave Hameson, and Moshe Brodetsky. There was a Beitar group there. There were so many leftist groups among the students at City College, all kinds, 57 varieties of Marxists, you see, from Trotskyists, this and that. And their minds were on other things, not on what was going on in Europe with the Jews. Not at all. Children of Jewish immigrants, Yiddish-speaking Jewish immigrants, who had absolutely no interest in what was going on in Germany, but had a great interest in what was going on in Spain and what was going on. And in that environment, the Beitarim were like on a different planet. Or the others were on a different planet, not on this planet.
So what was your main focus? What was motivating you?
Me?
Yeah, at that time. That was different than...
Well,
let me take a step back.
as
How did you feel after that first meeting that you went to of Beitar?
I felt that I belong here. That this is. In fact, I always felt ill at ease among young Jews because I didn't share with them the same concerns and the same feelings, And I used to argue with them and fight with them. And I'll tell you something. I remember being told by one of them, I forget what he accused me of, but he says, "Comes the revolution. They're going to get me." See, yep. They're going to get me. They were crazy. I remember them marching on the East Side against the war. The peace movement of the 1930s was not just America First and Coughlin and Lindbergh. No, it was our guys in City College and Brooklyn College, marching in the streets. The Yanks are not coming. Let God save the king. Yeah. They disrupted Jabo's meeting at Manhattan Center, you see. And this was Jabo's second meeting at that mat. Oh, yeah, he came here March 1930. The first meeting at the Manhattan Center was the end of March. And mind you, Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, France, Dunkirk, all of those things happened between the first meeting at Manhattan Center in March and the second one in June.
What year?
1940. 1940.
10 of May. On 10 of May in 1940 in Holland, in Belgium. And
Yes, yes. And these guys were crazy. They were crazy. And Beitar, Hashamat Sayir, or Habonim, or Bnei Akiva, those days they call it
Shomer Dati.
Shomer Dati, yes. All together were a tiny minority. The left was...
But the other Zionist movements were more similar to Beitar in terms of concern, or they were more similar to the leftists?
I didn't know, although I shouldn't have been surprised. There was a letter recently, I mean maybe 15 years ago, in the forward, the English language forward, from a young guy who was a student at City College and who wrote about the peace movement in the 30s and his experience at City College. And he listed among the groups Shomer Sayir and Habonim. They were mixed up, I'm telling you. I can't say all of them, I don't know, but yeah, they were also Fotlange. They were also in the Shomer Sayir kibbutzim in Israel. They mourned the death of Stalin as one of the great tragedies in Jewish history. So if that tells you something. And we were brown-shirted Jewish thugs, the Beitarim, in their eyes.
So after your first meeting at Beitar, how did you continue? Did you get involved immediately?
Yeah, I spoke to Rabbi Schroed because the building was a brownstone on Henry Street where the Talmud Torah was located. The top floor was just like a storage place. And I told him that I would like to organize a Beitar Ken on the east side, and I would like to use the top floor as a Moadon. And he arranged it. And then two of the guys that I met at the West Side Institutional Synagogue, Mosey Samuels, David Offner, came down to the east side with me, and we started to try to recruit. And my brother rounded up some of his friends, including Barney Troyansky, who was the father of Gil, Lee Mellis, who later became an actor in Hollywood, Hal Lieberman, and a bunch of others. And before I knew it, I had a group there. And for the first time in many years, there were youngsters in Beitar uniforms seen on the Lower East Side. And we did this, and we did that, and we did the other thing. And it's a good thing I did it, too, because well, first of all, I have to tell you that the first so-called mass meeting that I organized, we rented Clinton Hall on Clinton Street, and we distributed leaflets in Yiddish and in English, and we invited people to come to hear Colonel Morris J. Mendelsohn, Commander, Jewish War Veterans of America, Propers, Benish Epstein, this one, that one, about the hangings of Jewish patriots in Palestine by the British. It's 45. And I was so proud, you know, that I did this. And then we all came, meaning the speakers and some of the Beitarim and Beitariyot from uptown, and that's all. Nobody else showed up. And you know why? Because this was on the, I believe, the 15th of April. Roosevelt had just died, and the Jews were in mourning.
Wow.
So I was so depressed that I sent a letter to Propst resigning from the Beitar, and he sent me back a letter. He didn't accept my resignation. But the reason I say it was a good thing that I had organized that Beitar on the East Side is because there was a membership. And when the war ended and the guys came back from the army, I think it was Propst's idea. He rented a gymnasium in Harlem. He hired a famous judo teacher, and of course used some of the guys, the Beitarim, who were the veterans, and he announced a school to train people to go to Palestine, young Jews, and fight the British. And he had students because on the East Side, I had a membership. So together with whatever other members were around, 90 students were enrolled in that school, and the media, the newspapers, were informed there's a school in Harlem training people to fight the British in Palestine, to link up with the underground there. And we got publicity like you can't believe in every newspaper. And the State Department was quoted in the New York Times as saying, there is no law against training people to fight the British in Palestine. And then came the reaction. Believe it or not, the Balabotish Jewish reaction was not a good one. This was the Hitler Youth, some of them said. But young Jews in Cleveland, in Philadelphia, in Boston, in Detroit, in places that you wouldn't believe, besides in New York, responded. and wanted to join. And now we had I call it Kanimo in Brooklyn and the Bronx, in Washington Heights, and you name it. I would guess that we had maybe.
Hold on 1 second. Okay, sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. Hundreds of kids enrolled in Beitar. And there were groups all over. We had a problem with providing mefagdim and, but at the camp, we organized
Where was the camp?
Batei Sefer. The camp was at various times in different locations, but at this time it was near Ellenville, Spring Glen, New York. And we were able to organize Bet Sefer L'Madrichim to train people. And
you were one of the older ones, right?
yeah.
Because everybody
Yeah.
older than you went to fight.
Yeah. I would say not a majority, but a considerable minority, maybe 25% or 30% of the enrollees came out of the yeshivas. And in Beitar, unlike the other organizations, we had a mixture. You had religious, you had non-religious, and you had anti-religious. So in order to have peace and harmony, we adopted, this was the policy of Beitar, that in the Beitar premises, the Jewish traditions will be respected. Shabbat is Shabbat, Kashrut is Kashrut, and so on. Outside, it was not our business what you did. And that policy carried over, so even in Mevod Beitar and Ramat Razil, these were places that were established by American Beitarim. In your tzrif, you were free to do what you wanted. But on the grounds, it was Shabbat, you see. And also with kashrut. In fact, I remember that once in Ramat Razil, where the food was not the finest in the world, a woman in New York sent a parcel of Nabisco cookies to Ramat Razil. And the religious kids said, it's got to be destroyed because it was not sent to any member here, it was sent to the Meshek. And therefore, under the rule, and by the way, no way were those guys going to let those cookies be destroyed. So it caused a little problem. But as I said, we always had some religious kids. Brodetsky belonged to Beitar even before the war. And there were others like that. But now we had a substantial number, I say about a third. And the interesting thing is how they became bonded, how they became friends, lifelong friends, respecting each one the other's religiosity or lack of it. It was a great achievement. It was a great achievement. And in fact, in Washington Heights in 1947, for the first time, we started to get guys from the seminary at Yeshiva College, you know, and not just guys from the seminary. These were children of dynasties of Hasidic rabbis, including Twersky, who was the chief rabbi of Kiev in Europe and the chief rabbi of Boston at the time. 3 of his sons joined Beitar. Nachum, Moshe, and Yitzchak. Yitzchak in Boston, and Nachum and his other brother Moshe here in New York, and others. This was a kind of observant young Jews that we didn't have before, because they came from, as I said, from distinguished Orthodox families. And some of them became very active and became leaders in Beitar, and one made it to the Nitzivut. That was David Smith. And I want to tell you about David Smith. He was an orphan who had grown up in yeshivas, and he was considered an extremely brilliant student there at the seminary. He became a leader in Beitar, and he started organizing in the seminary. And he got permission to hold a meeting on a Sunday morning in the cafeteria, but the permission was granted with a condition that whoever our speaker was going to be would have to debate with members of their faculty. So none of us felt qualified because we didn't have the background, we felt. And somebody said Netanyahu, because he was a student at Dropsy for a PhD in Jewish history. He can do it. So we asked him if he'll go. He said yes. And on that Sunday morning, Isaiah Warshore and I, we got a car, we drove up to the west side. He lived in an apartment on Broadway in the 80s or 90s, I don't remember. Benjamin wasn't born yet, you know. The older boy was there. And we went to pick up Netanyahu to take him to the meeting. He forgot about it, you know. And we told him, we said, no, he said, I can't go. No, he forgot about it. And we told him there's a big crowd there, you know, and they're waiting. He said, I can't go. Why can't you go? He said, I don't have a clean shirt. Moshe says to him, what's his size? He's ready to run out and buy him a shirt, you know. He was a character. He came. We brought him up there. He demolished those guys. He demolished them. I can't remember the conversation that took place between him and these faculty people. But I remember one thing he said. He said, pacifism is not a Jewish virtue. It's a Christian virtue, which they don't observe. That I do recall. But there was a consequence to that meeting. Soloveitchik, who was the chancellor, I think. And by the way, Soloveitchik is regarded as the trailblazer, you know, for the modern Orthodox in America. He has a very good reputation. Soloveitchik called in the two Twersky boys, Smitty, a guy named Weisenfeld, he was from Springfield, Massachusetts. The ones who were finishing, they were about to get smicha. And he said, no smicha unless you quit what you're doing. And Smitty defied him. He left on the Altalena. He fought in the old city of Jerusalem in a failed attempt to retake it, which was mounted by Etzel. It was supposed to involve Haganah too. They didn't. And the Lehi had a disaster because they were on a truck that was loaded with ammunition that took a stray rocket or mortar shell and blew up. So, but Etzel did break into the city, into the old city by themselves. And of course they didn't take it, they had to withdraw. With casualties, there were two from the States, but it didn't happen in the old city. One was killed, one was wounded in the Russian compound where they gathered in order to make the attack, to break into the old city. And I found out later that those mortars, those shells, were not fired by Arabs or fired by the British, by English, in the Jordan Legion, in the Transjordan Legion. Anyway, why am I telling you about that?
What happened to Smitty?
Amazing, amazing. He was one of the settlers in Ramat Razil. He married a Yemenite girl, Beitarya. He went to law school part-time. I don't know whether it was at Tel Aviv University or at Hebrew University. He became a lawyer. He went on to become House Counsel, Chief Counsel for Klal, which was one of the largest financial institutions in Israel. The last time I saw him, I had lunch with him in the cafeteria of the Klal in Tel Aviv, of their building. He had children. He died young of cancer. He was observant. And years later, there was a revisionist in New York by the name of Benish Epstein. He was a Yiddish journalist. He wrote for the Tag Morgen Journal. He used to give the news on WEVD, the Yiddish radio station. My mother used to listen to Benish Epstein. He was one of the most important leaders in the revisionist movement in New York. And he did many things. Besides being a journalist, he was also the head of the United Yeshivas Foundation for a time. I said many years later, he was working for the ZOA, got a job on 34th Street for the ZOA, and he called me and asked me to come up and meet him there after work, which I did. And he said, that his job there was to prepare a newsletter to be distributed on Capitol Hill to Congress people and government officials. And he said, you know, my English is good, but it's not perfect. Will you look at it? I said, of course. And before we left, because it was people who worked there were gone, it was after hours, but before we left, I told him, one of the members of the Netzivot and a dear friend of mine, Selden Bod, he and his 19-year-old son, Eitan, who was a senior at Harvard, were on the TWA plane that had left Tel Aviv to go to Rome. He was taking them to Rome. He was taking his son to Rome. Stopped in Athens. And somehow or other, the terrorists got a bomb on that plane, and over the Adriatic, the plane blew up, and everybody was killed. Selden was Benish's son-in-law, married to Gilly, who was a Beit Aryeh. And Selden, of course, was a Beit Aryeh. So I said to Benish that I ran into Selden in Lower Manhattan, where I worked, before he left on that flight. And I said to him, no, he said to me that he was not happy in the work that he was doing. He was a lawyer. He was a tax lawyer, and he was working for a firm that specialized, a law firm, and a firm with a good reputation. I said, Selden, it's a great job. You have a nice home in Tuckahoe. You have a beautiful family. You know, what would you rather do? He said, archaeology. So I said to I told Benish what Selden had said to me. And Benish said that's why he was on the plane. The whole family was in Israel, he and his wife and the two sons. And his wife was teaching, I think at Rutgers. She taught botany. And she had to be back for registration or whatever. And she took the younger son with her. He had time. He was taking Eitan to Rome to look at the ruins or whatever. And then, talking about Selden, somehow or other we got on the subject of Smitty. These were both guys on the Netzivot, you know. And Benish told me that, and I didn't know this, he had been working for years to persuade Soloveitchik to give Smitty his smicha. And he said, eventually Soloveitchik did it. And what he told Benish was, you don't know what we lost when that boy left. In other words, he recognized that this was somebody special, you know. And he held out for years, but he granted him his smicha. We didn't know that Smitty eventually got a smicha, but he never worked as a rabbi. He was a observant Jew who worked for Klal.
One of the Twerskys was Soloveitchik's son-in-law.
That's right, Yitzchak.
Yeah.
I know that. And I'll tell you about Yitzchak, because Moshe Aarons was his mefaked in Boston, because he attended MIT. So he organized Beitar in Boston, Dorchester, Mattapan. I can't remember the other neighborhood. There were three neighborhoods there, and Yitzhak was a member of one of those groups. Ezrati told me that Yitzhak once threw an armful of Beitar leaflets at Weizmann in Boston. I couldn't believe it. You know, he ended up teaching at the Harvard Divinity School, you know. Died young.
Yeah.
Also died young. Anyway,
So Misha Ahrens was his mefaked
of course,
in Boston.
of course. And there was a Twersky who was murdered in Jerusalem just a few years ago. One of the guys who was butchered in a shul
In Harnov.
was a Twersky, was
In
one
Harnov,
of the grandsons, I think.
Yeah.
You know, yeah.
And
Yeah.
but so he left. He stopped being in Beitar so he could get a smicha. Did he listen? I mean, it wasn't his
You
father-in-law
talk
yet.
about Nochem? No, Yitzhak.
Yeah.
Yitzhak was not at that time at the yeshiva
Oh.
in New York. It happened to the seniors.
Uh-huh.
His older brother, Nochem, was one of those who was threatened, And I can't tell you whether he withdrew or he didn't withdraw. I don't know. I know what Smitty did. I don't know what Nochem did.
Okay. Wow. This is fantastic. Are you doing okay? Do you need a break or anything?
No,
Okay,
no.
great. All right. So what job did you? How did you progress in Beitar to becoming? You ended up with a more of a official position.
Yeah, I was under the Tzivut for 5 years,
Starting when?
starting in 45. And
How many people were on the Nitzivut?
okay, for most of the time that I served under Nitzivut, there was Moshe Ahrens was not in New York. He was studying at MIT, so he didn't come to New York until he graduated, and I think he graduated in 47. And he was a he served on the Nitzivut from 47. No, what happened? No. What happened in 40? This is very interesting. Propus it shouldn't have happened, and Misha regrets it, I'm sure, and I have some reservations about it. We told Propus in 47 that we wanted an American Netziv. And he was agreeable. The other members of the Netziv at that time were Seymour Rosenberg from the Bronx, an old Beitari. He had been in Beitar when Misha joined. Who else? Marty Martin, another interesting guy. Marty Martin, whose father was not Jewish, had come to New York with his mother and siblings from Germany, refugees. The children had been thrown out of the German schools because they were Jews. So he went to a Jewish school in Germany, and he joined Beitar in Germany. Then he came with his mother and siblings to New York, where they had family, and he looked for Beitar, and he joined Beitar. Marty Martin was one of the guys who was in the Beitar Aviation School. I'm going to tell you about the aviation school in a minute. And he was one of the guys who signed up for the Army right after Pearl Harbor. A whole bunch of them did. He went into the Army as a private. He came out a captain. He got his commission in combat. He served under Patton. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that I heard he searched for his father to kill him and gave up the search when he learned his father was in Algeria. He was in the Nitzuvut. He married a Beitar Yajani. He was one of my best friends. And unfortunately, he died of cancer some years ago. But he found that he couldn't make a living in civilian life. He went back to the Army. He remained in the reserves. He went back to the Army. He worked at the Pentagon for a time. He was one of the first in Vietnam as trainees, you know, lived in Formosa. He's buried in Arlington. He was a colonel when he retired from the Army. After he retired from it, he moved to Israel. He lived in Israel for a time, but I'm not going to tell you a lot more about him except to say this was one hell of a great guy. The Israelis would not give him a commission. He was a Beitari. That's another thing you have to understand. That for a long time after the establishment of the state, we were, you know what I mean? No benefits to the Etzel guys who were wounded or to their families of those who were killed or hanged. No acknowledgement. Marty was denied a commission in the IDF. He was a colonel of the U.S. Army.
Wow.
Okay?
What's his name?
Martin Marden, M-A-R-D-E-N. Marty Marden. One hell of a terrific guy and a natural soldier. I mean, he was a natural soldier. Okay.
So you approached Propus and said you wanted to have an American.
It wasn't me.
Oh.
It wasn't me. It was the others. Isaiah Warshaw. Isaiah Warshaw, he was from Brooklyn, I think from East New York. His father was a gabbai in a shul out there. Warshaw served in the 108th Cavalry in the Philippines during the war, also a decorated war hero. We were holding a meeting in the Pennsylvania Hotel, which later became the Statler Hotel near the Pennsylvania Railroad Station. When Warshaw came back from the West Coast, he had returned from the Philippines at the end of the war, and he went from Penn Station to the meeting before he went home, you know, and
One second.
Just a minute, please.
satisfied.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
He went to the meeting and he was back in action. You know, that Warsaw was a Beitari first, last, and always. He eventually married, when he was living in Israel, he married a young woman whose parents came from Iran. And I remember at in his apartment near Machane Yehuda, his brother-in-law said to us, my sister married the only American who doesn't have any money. Warsaw became a policeman in Israel. He was the border police, but he was in Ramat Razil first. And he also fought in the Old City. And he was one of the guys who knew what he was doing. I mean, he had battle experience, you know. Like Brodetsky had battle experience. Not all of them did, you see. On a visit to New York with his wife, we all got together once, and Ray Kaplan's wife, Rebecca, asked Warshaw's wife, how's his health? And she said, he has only one disease, Zionism. Now that tells you a lot about Isaiah Warsaw, you know. So he was a member of the Knesset. Terrific guy.
So who became the Netziv?
Let me put it this way. Misha became the Netziv. And at the time, I didn't really know Misha very well because he was in Boston. And he was pre-war.
He's older than you.
He's almost a year older. Almost a year older. I met him in Boston because he arranged for me to come up there to talk to the Hillel group at MIT. But I really didn't know him. But I had enough confidence in the other guys who were pushing for Misha that I voted for him too. But at the time, I honestly didn't know him. He served for 1 year. He's you know, he's a great guy. He wasn't as diplomatic in those days as he became later. But we got along okay. I have to say that is what I never heard a harsh word exchanged between any of them. And you know, the guys who came out of the army, they were entitled to $20 a week for 52 weeks from the government. That's how they were paid. Beitar didn't pay them. You know, I'm talking about the guys who were giving full time.
Beitar didn't pay them, and their only income was.
That's right. 52.20. 52.20. Yeah. And that's another thing that we didn't get money from the revisionist organization. And of course, not from UJA or anything like that. We raised money from revisionists who were in business. This one had a flooring business. This one had a supermarket. And there was only one wealthy man that was helpful to Beitar, and that was William B. Ziff, Ziff Davis Publications. He also a very fine guy, died young.
So what year did he become the Netziv? The first American Netziv was from 47?
47. Yeah, Grahamsville, New York. That was where in the camp we had the kinos, and that's where he was elected.
What were you doing at this point? You were out of high school already? Did you go to?
Yeah, no,
Were you doing this full time?
I started at City College.
Started at City College.
I was 16 years old when and I wasn't prepared.
City College up in 130.
No, 23rd Street in Lex.
What now is Baruch?
It's now Baruch.
Yeah.
And I wasn't really properly prepared for City College, and I was having a lot of trouble with some of the subjects there, particularly physics. And it didn't take long before they lost me altogether. And I didn't know what the hell was going on, you know. At home, there were serious problems with my father's health and my mother's health. So I didn't share it with them. I simply dropped out. And when I dropped out, I looked at the want ads for jobs, and I got jobs like shipping clerk, helper on a truck, and things. I didn't like these jobs. I went from one to the other, and then one day I saw an ad for copy boy at the Daily Mirror, and I ran up there, and the job was filled. So I went downstairs to a store where they had a phone book, and I looked up the addresses of all the other newspapers, and there were many newspapers. And I went from one to the other, and I was hired by the New York Sun as a copy boy. And for several years, I worked for the Sun, and then later for the Daily News. And that's when at the Daily News, I worked nights from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. And I had the days off during the week, which was like a 4-day weekend because I didn't have to go to work till 6. You see, you had to work weekends because the news daily, the pink edition came out on the weekend. But I now knew what I wanted, and I enrolled in the NYU School of Journalism while I was working in the field. And so I was working, I was going to school, and I was busy with Beitar all at this, and with my parents, who were having serious problems. I don't know how I did it. I don't know how I did it. Yeah.
After the 1 year that Moshe Ahrens was the Netziv, then who became the next Netziv?
Seymour Rosenberg. He had been a member of the Netziv for years. He went to Berkeley in San Francisco after he finished the 5220. And he was I think he finished in Berkeley at the time that I assume he finished, because he became Nazi. He succeeded Misha. And now I'm going to tell you a little bit about Seymour. He was a prince, really a prince of a guy. Begin came here in November 1948. The state had been established. This was after Altalena. And you can imagine how we adored Begin. Brodetsky, there was a girl named Levy. I can't think of her first name right now. It'll come to me. Tzipora Levy. She was from Brooklyn. She was Begin's secretary. She and Moshe would translate the communiques of Etzel into English and send them to me. The mail came in the envelopes of the Hebrew Literature Department at the Hebrew University or the Manufacturers Association, and I have all those envelopes, and I have the original translations, some of them by hand, and we published Yogun Press here, and we would distribute it as widely as we could. Okay, so Begin, he gave a speech once that on Rosh Hashanah, maybe 47, we distributed 100,000 copies of that speech in a whole bunch of synagogues on Rosh Hashanah. It was all, this too was translated either by Tzipora Levy or Moshe Verdetsky, and we did that. Anyway, Begin is coming. We were ready to have a mizdah for him at LaGuardia Airport when he arrived. We could have brought about 300 or so, maybe 400 at that time to the mizdah. And I got a phone call from Harry Lewis Selden at the American League for Free Palestine, which was the Bergson group, you know. And he told me not to do it. And he didn't just tell me not to do it. He was instructing me not to do it. Also, Shmuel Merlin. So we discussed it. What do we do?
Why didn't they want you to do it?
Okay, at that point we didn't have any understanding. We didn't know. By the way, we had a serious problem with those guys. Even though we worked together on many things, this idea of the Hebrew Jew, which Bergson used as a way to find a constituency because he didn't have any other constituency. He found Jews who responded to that approach. There were Jews and there were Hebrews. See? They were not Zionists.
Right. I want to talk more about Bergson in a minute, but
Okay.
go ahead. So go ahead.
So yeah, we discussed it. What are we going to do? So we decided, look, one thing we don't want to do, we don't want to have any scandal at the airport to spoil things. So we're not going to send out hundreds of people, but there will be 10 in uniform, and I'm going to give Begin a note explaining why there's no mizdah. See, we figured that's as far as we'll go. And that's what happened. I gave him the note. Shortly afterwards, we were invited to meet him. By the way, there was a dinner at the Waldorf Astoria, and I don't know if we went. I know that I was one of those who was listed among those who were supposed to be there. I'm not sure I went. But we were invited to meet him, went up to the Pierre Hotel on Central Park West, Seymour and I. And he was there together with Mordechai Ranan, who was commander of Etzel in Jerusalem, with Shmuel Tamir, with Yitzhak Elitzur Friedman. These were three commanders of Herzl, distinguished commanders during the Machferet, that accompanied him to New York. Also present was Mike Ben-Ami, Yitzhak Ben-Ami, that we knew because he was one of the guys who worked with Bergson. In fact, he preceded Bergson to New York, and he organized the American Friends of Jewish Palestine, which was raising money for Aliyah Bet before Jabo came. And who else was there? Yeah. I can't remember now offhand. But Begin, you know, after he asked each one of us, he asked Seymour and he asked me, you know, where did your parents come from? And we spoke about personal things. And then he told us that Beitar was not the right organization for America. It was appropriate for Poland, not for America. And that there should be here an organization, a youth organization, modeled after the youth division of the American League for Free Palestine, to support the Tnuat HaCherut in Israel. And Aliyah is not an issue because we have to bring the Jews from the countries of distress. So in America, that's not an issue. We were shocked. We were shocked. So we said to him, very soon, there won't be an American League for a Free Palestine, and there won't be a youth division of the American League for a Free Palestine, but there'll still be a Beitar. An argument started. We were arguing with him. Elitzur joined us. He agreed with us. Somebody said something to Seymour that Seymour had a temper, and Seymour gave it back to him. And then Begin admonished Seymour. And Seymour walked out. And Elitzur and Mike Ben-Ami ran after him to bring him back. And then Begin tried to make light of it, you know, and to restore some calm. But something had happened. We had rented a hall at the Hotel Diplomat for that mitzvah for Begin that we couldn't hold at the airport. So that was still going to take place, you see. And we had a kinus artzi up there in Grahamsville. No, was it in Grahamsville or in Pittsfield? To prepare our agenda for the Kinus Olami, the fourth Kinus Olami, which was going to be held in Tel Aviv in March of '49. But we felt we needed another Kinus Artsy. We're going to the Kinus Olami, but we're going there with our agenda. So, and what is our agenda? Anyway, there were 2 meetings with Begin, by the way. I think this was the second. I don't remember whether it was the first or the second where this happened. And Begin came to the Hotel Diplomat. Let me show you something. I'll be right back. I have a picture to show you.
Why don't you hold it and
תחזיק את זה אתה, אני חושב שזה... אוקיי, just a minute, please. Hold it. Okay, so... I see that...
This is me.
this is you?
Yeah, this is Ray Kaplan. This is Seymour Rosenberg. Here's Eli Tzur.
קצת בזווית ככה אליי, זה, אוקיי.
You recognize Begin?
Sure.
ברוך הבא מנחם בגין. אוקיי, זה כמו שאנחנו יכולים לתת למרכז מורשת בגין. מתנה יפה.
Yeah. Okay.
This is in the hotel.
Yeah,
This is the
Hotel
Diplomat.
צריך לרשום
Yeah.
אותה בדיוק את המיקום. Great.
And this is November 1948.
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Wow.
Wow.
Or October, I don't know.
Okay.
I don't remember. But anyway, I digressed. I skipped something very important, I think.
Okay.
Just a minute.
Why don't we have a seat and
Yeah.
Let's see the focus.
To understand what happened. We didn't understand at the time, and nobody explained it to us, unfortunately. After Altalena, Begin changed. Begin changed. We found out later that Aryeh ben Eliezer, Eli Tavin, Gidi,
Amichai Pagman.
Faglan, they took off for Paris after Altalena. And their intention, and there was somebody else too, to restart the Etzel.
To react to the... yeah.
Exactly. On his way to New York, Begin went to Paris. I think he had it out with them. And one by one, they came back to Israel, but not right away. So he had already had his message was, and I heard him say it at the Kinus, he didn't say it, that is to say at the Kinus Olami, he didn't say it to us in New York. He said, no more direct action, we will achieve our aims through as a parliamentary party. He was going on a different road. He didn't explain to us he's going on a different road. It came out in the wrong way. It came out in the wrong way. We felt at that time, and this was what we brought to the Kiddush Olami in Tel Aviv, that two things. One, the role of Beitar hereafter is to settle the borders. There were Beitar settlements already in Palestine, never mind what the left said. In Nachla Jabotinsky, in Nordia, in on the Syrian border, Mishmah HaYarden, Nachla Yitzchak, there were Moshavim, but we had a different idea in mind. Well, we wanted to settle on the border. And we wanted a big American representation in the Shultan, and we wanted to promote the Aliyah of Beitarim through these settlements to make the transition into the life of the country. And we think now that Begin had serious reservations about it for a variety of reasons. The Kinus Olamei pitted us and some of the local people, David Niv, there were others. There was a tug of war. Jeremiah Halperin didn't like the idea of settlements altogether because it was, something that the left did. That, the wrong emphasis. Look, Misha and Begin argued at that kibbutz about things, We got some of what we wanted in the resolution. Oh, by the way, the Etzel guys who were not members of Beitar had a right to vote and were there at the we were sandbagged, okay? But anyway, the upshot is that we were on a different wavelength, okay? But we didn't understand really where he was going and where he was coming from, and that's unfortunate. We would have, I think, we would have understood. But in any case, I wanted to mention something that I didn't mention and I think is significant. In 1946, there was an election in New York for governor and senator. Tom Dewey was candidate for governor, Lehman and Meade. I don't know what offices each one was running for, but they were the Democratic candidates, and Dewey and Ives were the Republican candidates. And Banish Epstein was working, he always had a million jobs. He was working for the state Republican organization, and he was working under a guy by the name of Bernard Katzen. And Propus called a meeting of the Nitzavut, and Banish was there, and we found out that the Republicans would pay for a sound truck so that we could go out into the Jewish neighborhoods and call upon the Jews not to vote for the Democrats because the Jewish state was still not yet established.
Explain why you felt strongly one way or the other.
I personally, or the Nitzivut?
The Nitzivut.
The Nitzivut went for it. I didn't.
Well, you had a problem with the Democrats?
And how? The idea here was, see, Truman had not been elected president. He succeeded FDR. He was vulnerable. He was vulnerable, first of all, because he was Truman. Second of all, the Democratic Party was split 3 ways. Beside the regular organization, you had the Wallace group and you had the Southerners. I think he was also a Wallace down there.
Strom Thurmond?
No, it doesn't matter.
Right.
There were Dixiecrats,
Right.
there were progressives, and there was the regular organization. So the Democratic Party was vulnerable come 48, which was when Truman would have to run for election. The issue of a Jewish state, of the 100,000 certificates and all that, Truman, believe it or not, was not pro-Zionist. He had been, by the way, on the committee as a senator. He had been on one of Bergson's committees. I mean, it's a nominal thing. I mean, he wasn't active in any way. He resigned because of something or other. But we felt that unlike FDR, this guy is vulnerable. And we got to send him a message in 46, you see, of what he can expect in 48. And the message has to be, he loses New York. He loses New York. At the time, I didn't have that conviction yet, that was the right thing to do, because I knew that one of the problems we were having was that, we were considered right-wing and all that. And this would only accentuate it among Jews, you see. That, like they always said, this is where we are. But I was wrong. When the vote was taken, the vote was to do it. I was Machleket HaTamulah, the guy in charge. I had to organize it. We went out 36 neighborhood meetings in every Jewish neighborhood in the city. We didn't ask anybody to vote for the Republicans. We begged them not to vote Democrat. And we explained why. Except for one incident, we were well received. And the one incident was on Delancey Street and Norfolk Street. In order to go with a sound truck, you have to get a permit. And the permit tells you what time and what location. And on Delancey Street, it was around 7 o'clock in the evening. I think that we had a right to be at that corner, Norfolk Delancey and Norfolk. But the ALP truck was there when we arrived, the American Labor Party. And the guy who was talking in Yiddish. And while we're waiting for him to get out of there, he says to the crowd, there were Jews, he's in Yiddish, he says, there were Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto that collaborated with the Nazis to kill Jews, and they were known as revisionists, and here they are now they are here to tell you to vote for Dewey. And then he left. The crowd attacked our truck. And they were shaking the truck. And there was so much noise that was amplified by the microphone that nobody heard me. And fortunately, the 7th precinct, the police precinct on Clinton Street in Delancey, they came very fast and they said to the driver, "Get the hell out of here." And that's how we escaped. Warshaw was on the ladder leading up. I was on the top of the truck. And Warshaw was on the ladder fighting off people with his feet who were trying to get at me.
Wow.
That's what happened. The upshot was the Democrats were defeated in New York.
Do you know the name William Herlands? Herlands?
No. No.
He was he had been a city commissioner under LaGuardia. But he was a Dewey boy.
Mm-hmm.
Dewey took him to be state commissioner of investigation.
Well, I want to tell you something that Truman recognized Israel in May, and he ran in November, and he didn't carry New York.
Well, Dewey was he was running against Dewey in 40.
Yeah. And to my surprise, I even got a letter from Dewey after that 46 election thanking me for my help. I didn't have any contact with Dewey. He got it from Katzen, I'm sure. I have the letter.
Let's talk about a little bit about the Bergson group. What was your first awareness of them or encounter with them?
Well, you know, they were Etzelniks when they came here. And they were stranded here, actually. I have to backtrack a little bit. According to Ben Ami, and by the way, among all of them, Ben Ami was the closest to us. And the reason why we were able to get our guys on the Ben Hecht and to get our guys on Alta Lena and to do all kinds of things was through Ben Ami. Ben Ami, there was a good relationship between Ben Ami and us. Before he came to New York, I think back in 39 or maybe even 38, I think 39, Jabotinsky wanted to meet FDR. And he had a plan to move about 1.5 million Jews out of Europe. And he tried through the American ambassador in Warsaw and the American ambassador in Paris. And he got nowhere. So he got a hold of Bobby Briscoe, who was the mayor of Dublin, and a Jew, and a revisionist, and a hero of the Irish Republican Army.
Robert Briscoe.
Yeah.
Bobby Briscoe.
Bobby, it's the...
Bobby's nickname for
Okay.
Yeah. And he got a hold of John Henry Patterson, who had been the commander of the Jewish Legion in World War I, the famous lion killer and so on. And a guy named Lubinsky, who was an Etzelnik. And he sent them to the United States to contact the Irish guys here. Farley, who was the Postmaster General and who had been the manager of FDR's campaign in one of the elections. Bill O'Dwyer, who eventually became mayor of New York. Ed Flynn, who was the Democratic leader in the Bronx. To persuade FDR to meet Jabotinsky. And they failed. They tried and they failed. But they did have a meeting with Herbert Lehman, Felix Frankfurter, and Louis Brandeis. And they were told there's a ship called the SS Pilsudski that can carry 10,000 people that the Poles are ready to sell. With $500,000, we can buy it. And we can move 10,000 Beitarim out of Poland and try to get them to Palestine. They weren't interested. Rothschild in France had been approached. He called Weizmann. Weizmann said, don't go near them. The mission was a failure, except that the American Friends of the Jewish Palestine was created by Ben Ami. He was here before Bergson. And it was non-sectarian. And its purpose was to raise money for Aliyah, Bet Afalpi, they called it. And that was here. That was here. When Jabo arrived in 40, March, his pitch was a Jewish army, And he met with the editors of the Yiddish papers together. Also John, what was it? A famous non-Jewish novelist. I can't think of his name now. His wife was Jewish. And also a couple of Jewish publicists, Bill Ziff and Harry Lewis Selden. And he explained what he had in mind. And it was not a Jewish brigade with Jews from Palestine. It was an army to be recruited from Jews around the world, in Europe, in the Americas, and as a co-belligerent. There was a war being waged against the Jews, and the Jews had to fight back as Jews, you see. And that was his pitch. There was a British ambassador here at the time. His name was Lord Lothian. Lord Lothian. His real name was Kerr. He had been one of the guys who was working for Lloyd George during the First World War when the Balfour Declaration came out. A good guy, a good guy. Now, mind you, the British are practically on their knees. They've suffered one disaster after another. Lothian recommends that they should raise a Jewish army of 100,000 men and even a Jewish squadron in the Royal Air Force. And he explains the benefits to Britain at that point.
We're talking about MERS 1940?
We're talking about approximately May. I can't give you the exact date. Approximately May
Okay.
1940, yeah.
We're talking about Jabo before he died.
He's here, yes.
He's here.
Yeah, he's here. And he's making that pitch.
Yeah. It's
And
amazing.
here the British ambassador. And he gets, Churchill replaces Chamberlain after Dunkirk. And Lothian gets instructions that Britain is to be represented officially at the June meeting at the Manhattan Center, which was where Jabotinsky was going to make the second pitch. So, also there was something else that happened. Canada had agreed that the army could be assembled in Canada and would receive training in Canada provided the British concurred. So they had that commitment too. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. There is no proof that FDR shot it down. But there's evidence, circumstantial evidence. Alex Raffaelli worked for Elmer Davis at the Office of War Information. And he came to his boss, to Elmer Davis, and he said that the broadcasts that OWI was making to Europe in French and Norwegian and so forth and so on, there has to be a Yiddish broadcast aimed at the Jews of Eastern Europe. And Elmer Davis agreed that there should be such a thing. And not only that, but Raffaelli told him, there's a guy in New Orleans who owns the United Fruit Company. It was a Bessarabian Jew.
Sam,
Yes, he'll pay for it. It won't even cost the government a penny. And Elmer Davis took it to Roosevelt. And Roosevelt said to him, no, let it go.
No, it's come to the...
Oh, Roosevelt said to him, don't you turn...
1 second.
Yeah.
Wait till it stops ringing.
Roosevelt said to him, don't turn this into a Jewish war. Because Hitler said it's a Jewish war. There's every reason to believe Roosevelt shot it down. Because a Jewish army as a co-belligerent would have changed the status. And by the way, Claire Booth Luce, she was married to Luce. She was a congresswoman. She said, because I'll tell you what happened in the end, but she said, you know, the American public is not for changing the immigration laws, but they'll understand this. They'll understand this. What they say is the Jews want the United States to fight the Germans. They don't say, we will fight the Germans. She made a point. The American public will understand this. You see, she was right, because there would have been very little opposition. This was a possibility, and Jews in the neutral countries could get out of Europe if they were enabled to go to Canada to join the Jewish army. You see. Anyway, Stephen Wise, he was head of the American Jewish Congress, he was head of the World Jewish Congress, he was head of the ZOA, together with a bunch of others that I can give you all the names, went down to Washington to tell the British ambassador Lothian that this proposal endangers the Jews of America. It's a fact.
Just a minute.
About the League.
We'll get back to that in the. You want to take a break?
Yeah, let's take a break.
Okay,
I need to change
fine.
the button.
But almost all of the interviews are in Israel, and with people who might have been in that cell in Haganah. But to hear the perspective from what was going on here, I don't think we've had anything like this. This is fantastic. This is amazing.
It makes sense of the thinking about what happened for all the picture, for the big picture.
Yeah.
Why do you think that this is not widely known?
The same, partially the same reasons that you were mentioning, where the people who
I'll tell
write
you
this-
why. I'll tell you why. I was going to tell you at the beginning. Eli Tavid asked me once to write up a history of the American revisionist movement for something they were going to publish about the world revisionist movement. I said to him, I can't write about anything that I didn't participate in. And I only joined Beitar in 43, so I can write from 43. But before, I can't write about it. He meant about the American movement. So he said, don't worry about it. I'll get somebody else to do that. And he got Benish Epstein. Then I sent in my thing, and he sent me Benish's thing. I read Benish's thing, and Benish, he doesn't stick to the up to 43. He did the whole thing from 43 on. And what do you think? Bergson is not there. The whole Bergson operation is not there because they're not revisionists as far as he's concerned. They're not even Zionists as far as he's concerned, you see. Now, that was the point I was trying to make. It's not just labor that edits out. Benish edited out, you know, and those guys edited out also. That's how our story never came out. Nobody's interested in our story, you see, and yet we were deeply involved, you know, and I think in some ways, you know, in very important ways, and yet I've seen books about, there's an organization here called the American Veterans of Israel. And they go every year to Mickey Marcus's grave up in West Point. And we have guys who were in Etzel who belonged to AVI. And AVI at one point was asked, I don't know by which organization, I guess the veterans, to give them a report on the role of AVI or whatever. They left out the Etzel guys completely. So Zvi Krauscher, who by the way also fought in the old city, and Ray Kaplan, they wrote to the head of the AVI and they complained bitterly and they got an answer. You see, it was a mistake, but it's too late to change it. Okay? That was one incident. The other incident, somebody wrote a book about, maybe it was Habonim? No. By the way, I have the documentation on all this, the excuses, you see. Why didn't the book talk about the Etzel? Because in a book that was published by some Englishman, he already mentioned it. There is such a thing as censorship. It's taboo, but it's on both sides. And I'll tell you about Begin too, you know. Begin was the Natziv of the Beitar in Poland. But his what do you call it? His Yerisha is Etzel, not Beitar. Why? Yeah. So, you know, by the way, these right-wingers, I want to tell you about the right-wingers, at least the American Beitar. In 48, there was an election. There was an Nitzivut, every one of us voted. I voted for Wallace. Seymour Rosenberg voted for Norman Thomas, was the socialist candidate. The others voted for Truman or Dewey. Why is that significant? Beitarim were not necessarily extreme right-wingers. What we shared was the recognition that it's time to fight. You see, that's all we shared.
Did you ever meet Hillel Cook?
Oh yeah, the last time I saw him was in Tel Aviv, and he was outside the building where the Tnuat HaCherut had its offices. They didn't have their offices in the Metzudan Zev. They had a different place, and there was a park bench there. And he was sitting alone, you know. And I was tempted, you know, to chat with him, but I didn't. By the way, I want to tell you what Ben Ami told me about Cook in Kfar Vitkin. Because the Alta letter went to Kfar Vitkin. And it went to Kfar Vitkin because the government told them to go to Kfar Vitkin. And that's where the trouble started. And when the officer of the IDF who conveyed the message to Begin, you got 10 minutes, you know, and Begin was arguing. Ben Ami told me that Cook told what was his name? Another one of the guys, his name will come to me. I brought the ship. He's negotiating. Cook was ready to give them the arms there in Krakow. You know, so who was it? It was
from the side of the Agana. You try to remember maybe Galili.
no. It was one of our guys. There was two brothers from the Sudan. Gershon Hakim. Gershon Hakim was the guy who took Ben Ami up to West Point. It was below West Point. There was a graveyard of ships that were decommissioned, American warships, after the Second World War. And it was Gershon Hakim who had the idea that they should get an LST, because an LST, it's for tanks, to carry tanks. It can go directly to the shore. You don't need a deep harbor. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to transport arms. That was the Altalena was an LST. So it was Gershon who put the idea into Ben Ami's head that they should buy the LST, because the government was selling these as surplus, you see. And so, and it was Gershon who was there in Kvarvitkin. And it was Gershon that Cook said to Gershon, look, we brought the ship and he's negotiating, you see. Cook would have given them the arms. Now, that's what Ben Ami told me, you see.
Meaning that Bergson, the Altalena was purchased here.
Yes.
By Bergson's group.
Right.
And then Bergson was upset of what was happening on the
at Kvarvitkin, yeah.
Because he would have...
yeah.
And who was refusing?
Begin. He wasn't refusing. He was arguing with the guy. He gave him 10 minutes. Look, Begin had no reason to believe that they were going to shoot. He really didn't. And they shouldn't have. They killed people for no good reason. And I'll tell you something, that there was a guy on the Altalena, I don't know how he got there. He was an Italian Catholic by the name of, it'll come to me. He came back to the States with 7 bullets in him. He was at Mount Sinai Hospital, you know. Yeah. Why? 2 boys from Cuba, Betarim, were killed on that ship. Stavsky, he was shot in the leg. He died of exposure and shock. 16 were killed. Why? Do you know that, let me tell you what happened when they went to Tel Aviv. When the war broke out in the Second World War in September 1939, there was a ship, and I can't remember the name of it, with refugees from Europe that was attacked by the British as it approached the Palestine coast. There were people killed. The first fatalities inflicted by the British in World War II were Jews on that ship.
Rafua, I will remember the name. It's in 1940, in the beginning of 40, no.
Fishman Street.
Yeah.
Fishman Street, where it touches the Yam.
Yeah.
You know, that's where the ship was sunk.
Okay.
And the Altalena didn't make it to shore because it got stuck on the wreck of that ship. In other words, Gershon's idea that the LST could make it to the beach didn't happen because that ship was under the water, and they got stuck on that ship. And the guys had to jump off and swim, and some of them were shot in the water. And one of the guys who was swimming was Warshaw, and I have a letter from him that he wrote afterwards describing everything that happened there. You know, we had a Beit Aryeh here named Newman. She was a mefakedet in Queens, and a good friend of Miriam's. And she married a guy who was an aeronautical engineer, and he volunteered to serve in the infant Israel Air Force as an aeronautical engineer. He told her and she told us that they were asked to bomb the Altalena. These were volunteers from America, pilots, engineers. They refused. They refused, you know. And where did the guys from the Altalena go afterwards? They went to Jerusalem. They fought in Jerusalem. They helped to save Ramat Rachel from the Egyptians. They were eulogized by the Haganah commander there. The reason he was a Haganah commander and not an IDF commander is because Jerusalem was supposed to be an international city. It was not supposed to be under Israel's control, according to the partition resolution.
Is that Musa Yarkoni, the commander there?
Yeah.
Did you ever meet Ben Hecht?
I would say yes. I didn't know him.
Uh-huh.
I didn't know him, but he did quite a job. He did a tremendous job.
Did you see a performance of The Flag is Born?
We did it ourselves. We had a drama group, and we did the same show with our people. Yeah. But I didn't go to the theater to see their show, no.
Did it have an impact, the show?
Had a tremendous impact. Had a tremendous impact. They were doing what had to be done, and they were sabotaged. You know, that people were told. I'll give you an example. When there were meetings organized to raise money for the Aliyah Bet, this is before the war, and you got some celebrity or opera singer or whatever, you know, to come to the meeting. The other side, the Balabotish Zionists, they would get in touch with that person and say, you know, these are fascists, and you shouldn't be doing what you're doing, and so on and so forth. Henry Munter, who was the head of United Jewish Appeal at that time, sent out letters to rabbis telling them why they shouldn't give money to the revisionists to bring those ships with prostitutes and with criminals and why and this. And I have the letter because one of the rabbis was one of our guys. He got the letter signed by Henry Munter.
Who was anybody else raising Aliyah Bet?
Yeah.
Most of the Aliyah Bet ships, if not all, they were all from here.
No.
No?
No. The first Aliyah Bet ship was sponsored by the Polish Hechalutz. And they did it without the authorization from the Sochnut. And they succeeded with the first one. And that was in 1934. And the second one, they didn't succeed. And the Sochnut was not encouraging it. They were not encouraging it because they were trying to placate the British. They thought this was going to spoil the relationship with the British.
But a lot of the ships were being purchased here.
Yes.
So who was raising money for that? Were they competing to raise the money? Meaning were...
First of all, you have to understand that there were two periods, pre-war and wartime, and post-war. For the Haganah, the main period was post-war. For the Etzel, the main period was pre-war and during the war. But there were others beside Etzel before then, but it was, as I said, the Polish Hechalutz. Look, whatever certificates were being given out were being given out to the German Jews. But there were 3 million Polish Jews, you know. You had people in Hachsharar over there for years and years and years and waiting for certificates, you see. So the first ones to defy the Sochnut on Aliyah Bet were the Polish Hechalutz. See. The revisionists got into it afterwards. And it was out of Vienna. That is... Aryeh Jabotinsky was deeply involved in that.
Did you know him?
Oh yeah, what a guy. Oh, that's something I forgot to tell you altogether. Jabo dies, Aryeh's in prison because he brought in the Zachariah. 2,400 kids he brought out of Europe.
I don't know the story.
Yes, it's a tremendous story. They rented the Zachariah from 2 Turkish owners, partners, the Turkish ship, to go to Constanza in Romania on the Black Sea to carry 2,400 passengers to Palestine illegally. Now you have to understand the British. First of all, they're bringing pressure on Romania, on Hungary, on Bulgaria, on not to cooperate. See. In addition, they're flying their planes to check who's going and who's coming and how they, you know, they're doing everything possible to cut off this way. The Danube flows from the middle of Europe to the Black Sea. You don't need a passport, you don't need a visa. It's an international waterway, and if you can buy a ship, which you can with money, nobody can stop you from going down to the Black Sea. See? If there's a way out of Europe for Eastern European Jewry, it's the Danube. See? By the way, till 41, even the Germans didn't interfere. On the contrary, they were pushing them out, you see. So this is it. This is the way. And this was the revisionist way. And as I said, the British did everything. Eventually they used radar against these ships, you know. And also, if you confiscate a ship, you know that the price to rent it goes up, you see. So after a while, it gets harder to buy them or to rent them. And after a while, you're using unseaworthy craft. The Struma was dredged up from under the river and was given a motor, a used motor, you know, had one toilet for almost 800 people, you know. I mean, the Jews were trapped. They were trapped. You know? So, the reason I make this distinction is because, oh yeah, getting back to the Zechariah, what happened was that they were going to get down to Constanza in barges. But the thing dragged out so long that the barges were stuck in ice in the winter of '39. And they spent the winter on these barges. And the Romanians wouldn't let them go off, and the Hungarians wouldn't let them go off. And the Jews brought them food and clothing. They would not have survived the winter, except that there were Jews who came and helped them. And Dov Gruner was one of them. And Weiss, Yaakov Weiss, who was hanged.
Yeah. No, I think Yaakov Weiss came with...
Came from Hungary.
Yeah.
He came on the Zechariah.
No.
He did. He came on the Zechariah. What were you going to say?
No, he came... He was the only one that was the illegal passenger on the train of Kastner. It's another story. I know.
The Hungarian?
Yeah.
He's a friend of Elitzur's. He's a friend of Elitzur's. He came from Hungary.
Yaakov Weiss, yeah.
Yeah.
Hungary.
He was not on the Zechariah then.
No, Zechariah.
Okay, maybe you're right. Maybe you're right. But Gruner was, and Elitzur was.
It's very early.
Yeah.
Yaakov Weiss was part of the cross, the Black Cross in '44. So it's right along after that.
You've been in Romania?
Yeah, in Hungary.
In Hungary, I'm sorry, in Hungary.
In '44. It just came, it came with it's almost in the end of the war. He came to Netanya. I know exactly the story about
Elitzur's wife, a couple of years ago, received from somebody in Israel letters that was sent to Elitzur when he was still in Israel from Yaakov Weiss when he was in Akko.
Wow.
She has those letters.
I met his daughter. I interviewed his...
Okay,
his
sister. You know better about... Okay, I thought he was because they both came from the same place. Elitzur was not from Hungary. He was from Czechoslovakia, but from the Hungarian part of Czechoslovakia, Ruthenia. You know, so, and they were friends, so I assumed he came with him, but he didn't. Okay, but there were 2,400 kids. Well, they weren't 2,400 kids.
Yeah.
Some of the Beit Harim were put ashore in Hungary because there were Hungarian Jews, and I think religious, who paid to come on to the Zechariah, to come on those barges to go down to the Zechariah. And those kids who were put off the barges, they ended up on the Struma. But anyway, that's the distinction between the Etzel Aliyah Bet and the Haganah Aliyah Bet. The Haganah Aliyah Bet was mostly a post-war thing.
And Aryeh Jabotinsky, you said, was in prison.
Yes, he was arrested by the British, and he was in prison when Jabo died. Jabo wrote this ambassador Lothian was succeeded by Halifax, and Jabo wrote a plea to Halifax that they were going to strip his son of his Palestine citizenship. You know, back Jabotinsky was stripped of his Palestine citizenship. He traveled on a League of Nations passport of some kind. But after Jabo died, Netanyahu took Madame Jabotinsky down to Washington to meet with Taft, Senator Taft, which makes me think that maybe Abba Hillel Silva had some involvement because he was from Ohio. It was Taft who intervened to secure Aryeh's release. And then Aryeh came to New York, and he organized glider clubs and other things in Palestine and Poland. And he decided to organize an aviation school here, Beitar Aviation School, and in an airport out in Queens, first 25 cadets, and then later another 25. There were a total of 50 cadets that were signed up, all Beitarim, to learn to fly and to get the license, the pilot license. And the Hearst papers and the PM, they wrote it up, you know, with pictures and everything. And it so happens that the I don't know if he was the commander of the Jewish War Veterans at the time or ex-commander, this Morris J. Mendelsohn. He lost an arm in the Spanish-American War fighting in Cuba. He negotiated with the Canadians. This was before the United States entered the war, for a Jewish squadron in the Royal Canadian Air Force. And there were 50 cadets, and the Canadians were agreeable. Now you have to remember that in World War I, you had the Lafayette Escadrille, which were American volunteers who served before the United States entered the war in the French Air Force. And during the Second World War, you had the Eagle Squadron in the British RAF, which were volunteers from the United States before the United States entered the war. And the Canadians were agreeable to a Jewish squadron in the Royal Canadian Air Force. And here were the people. The first class graduated, and the second class had just begun when Pearl Harbor happened. And all of them went into the United States military, so the Jewish squadron never emerged. Why is it significant? I don't know if these two things really relate to each other, but a historian of the South African Air Force in World War II wrote a book that I read about the activities of the Royal Air Force out of Foggia, Italy, on the Adriatic when they captured, when Italy was invaded. The Americans were on the western side, Naples, Rome, and the British 8th Army was on the eastern side, and they captured Foggia. There was a big air base in Foggia, and they were operating over the Balkans and over Poland from that air base already around 1944 or earlier, maybe 43, 44, whenever it was. And they were dropping weapons to the Polish Home Army, and even officers, trained officers that they dropped over there, Polish officers. And they were bombing in Romania and Hungary, the Ploiesti oil fields in Romania. But they were losing a lot of planes. And the Royal Air Force commanders didn't think it was worth it, especially since they had plenty to do in Italy, and they wanted to invade France from the Mediterranean, to land in the south of France. They were preparing that. They needed the planes, they needed the pilots. Churchill said, no, we owe it to the Poles. We owe it to the Poles. But it reached a point where he had to give in. And the deal was made that with Polish pilots, they'll go from Foggia, you see. But there were Polish pilots in the RAF, you see. There were no Jewish pilots in the RAF to go on these kind of missions, you know. But the thing is that by the way, Pecan, Hirsch, these were guys who were among those cadets who were killed during the Second World War in Europe. Yeah.
I want to ask you about a few different events to see, you know, what you remember about when they were happening. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising.
Yeah, I met Davinsky when he was in New York. I met him in Propus's apartment. He was the head of the revisionist organization in Warsaw. And he was in the resistance leadership there in Warsaw. And I've read accounts by this guy in that. You know, when Misha wrote his book about the ghetto uprising and the role of the ZZW, it got a lot of attention. But the truth is, and it was very important to set the record straight. But there were books written before. Among them was Zeidman of the Aguda.
Chaim Lazar.
Chaim Lazar, right.
מצדה של ורשה.
Yes, there were books written before. But for some reason, nobody picked up on it, you know. And with Misha, he was an important figure, defense minister, foreign minister. So he was able to get the story across. The others couldn't. Even Davinsky wrote. Davinsky wrote. So there were at least three, maybe more. Einstein, Reuben Einstein, mentioned it in his book. It's the old story, you know. But yeah.
But you know, in those days, in the 40s, do you heard about it, what was happened?
Yes.
Yeah, in the 40s. You
Oh,
remember?
yeah. There was a Warsaw shul on Rivington Street on the Lower East Side. There was a mass meeting. Tens of thousands of people. They couldn't all get into the shul. The streets were jammed with people at the time of the ghetto uprising, because the ghetto uprising lasted about 2 months, you know. Bergson brought rabbis down to Washington, 400 Orthodox rabbis. Roosevelt left the White House. He wouldn't see them. Sam Rosenman, who wrote his speeches, told him not to meet these people. Wallace met them, you know. Where the hell was the American Jewish community?
When was that the feeling overall in Beitar? When
Yes. And how? We had guys from Warsaw in Beitar. I'll tell you a story. When we went to that kinus in Tel Aviv, it was Seymour Rosenberg, Ray Kaplan, Tevye Shachori, and me coming from the States. Misha was in Israel already. He was a delegate, and Smitty was a what do you call they have an alternate in case, you know. The kinus kept being postponed. It was supposed to be in March, it was supposed to be in April. It ended up, I think, in June. I spent 10 weeks in Tel Aviv. I lived at 16 Allenby in the apartment of an Australian revisionist family. By the way, their daughter was lost in Yahud. There were two girls when the Etzel took Yahud and then were driven out, and then they came back. The two girls were missing. And one of the girls was from the Moritz family that I lived with. And nobody knew what became of them. And it turned out later that there was a tower of some kind in Yahud, and the girls were sent up in order to be lookouts.
It's a tower of a mosque.
Yeah. And then when the Etzel was expelled, the girls were still left behind. When they came back, there were no girls. And the Red Cross and the UN and this and that, you know, but till this day, nobody knows. But anyway, Sammy Moritz and I became very good friends, her brother. And he was in the army, and he had a friend named Aryeh, and they joined us on the Teaud. We were running around the country. We were in Tzfat, and we wanted to go to Tveria. So we're hitchhiking on the road. That's how we got around, you know. So a truck stopped, and the guy said, he's not going to Tveria, but he's going on the way to Tveria. So if we want to come, jump on. We jumped on, and he let us off near a kibbutz called Hamadia. We're hungry, we're dirty. We decide to go into the kibbutz and get something to eat and wash up. We walk into the Cheder Ochel, and there's a guy there. By the way, it must have been a poor kibbutz because they were dressed like in rags practically, you know, not... There's a guy there who looks like Tevye Shachori's twin. Tevye Shachori is Ted Schwartz. He came to the U.S. from Warsaw. He was active in the Warsaw Beitar. He was a member of the Nitzibut at that time in the United States. They look at each other. Everybody's staring. They look like twins. Turned out they're first cousins, both from Warsaw. Neither of them knew that the other one was alive, you know. So by a coincidence, and we have a picture, Ray took a picture, which I still have in an album, of these two guys, you know. And to tell you more about it, Misha has been searching for a picture of Frankel, who was the commander of ZZW because there's no picture of him. And he finally arranged to have several people who knew Frankel to meet with the police artist who, based on descriptions, will make a sketch. And that's all you have of Frankel. I got a call from Misha one day, and he said to me, whatever became of Tevye's belongings? Because Tevye must have had pictures from the Warsaw Beitar. Maybe Frankel is in that picture. Tevye died in Toronto. And what I remember is that he had friends in Toronto who carried out his will. His will was to be buried next to Shlomo Ben Yosef in Rosh Pina. And that's where he's buried. So, and they all, I told Misha, I said, what I remember hearing is that his belongings were sent to the Jabotinsky Institute in Tel Aviv. So he got in touch with the Jabo Institute, and then he called me back and he said, what was the date? What the hell do you need a date for? But it turns out the way the Jabo Institute is storing this stuff, you got to know the date. So I said to him, I don't remember the date, but I said that Jonathan Friedman, the son of Elitzur, who lives in Rehovot, he was at the burial there of Tevye in Rosh Pina. He'll know. So he called Jonathan, and he was able to give them the date. And they found Tevye's stuff, but no picture of Frankel. No picture of Frankel.
November 29th, 1947, the UN vote.
Yeah, I can tell you something about that too. It's a disgrace. After the Exodus event, and you know, one of the boys from Passaic was killed by the British on the Exodus. He was in the route where they, yeah. We heard that 3 British warships were going to visit New York, and that some organization was going to have a ball, a Royal Navy ball in the 66th Street Armory, Park Avenue, 66th Street, in honor of the Navy. And this was the first official visit of the Royal Navy to the city of New York since the Second World War, okay? We had a plant.
This is the summer of 1947.
Yeah, before the UN vote, before, you know.
After the Exodus, before the UN vote.
Exactly, exactly. I'm sure that the Haganah had plants in our organization, and we had plants in theirs. And one of them was this Mosey Samuels. And he informed us, you know, that we probably can get them to cooperate, meaning the Zionist youth groups, American Zionist, there was a college level group, there was another group, this group, that group, for a demonstration at the Royal Navy Ball. So we made an overture that we would like to cooperate with them if they were willing to have a demonstration at the Royal Navy Ball. After all, the Exodus was a Haganah ship, right? So we had a meeting, and the agreement was that we will carry their banners, we will distribute their leaflets. In other words, It's going to be their show. And that was the deal. I got a call from Benjamin Oxton, who later became dean of the law school of Hebrew University. He was working on the American Zionist Emergency Council under Silver, okay? A former revisionist. I didn't know him, but I got a call to come to his office, which was on Madison Avenue somewhere. We were on 55 West 42nd Street. So Warshaw and I went over there. And Oxon says to us, I want you to cancel the demonstration at the Armory. So I said, we want you. I said, look, we're not the only ones. All the Zionist youth groups are in on this. He says they've all agreed to cancel. I said, why do you want us to cancel? He says, because there's going to be a UN vote, and they're going to be, this is an event at the Armory where there are going to be a lot of delegates from other countries. We don't want to antagonize them. So I said, I don't think that how they vote at the UN is going to be influenced one way or another by whether there is a demonstration or there isn't a demonstration. He also asked us something else. He said we were going to send a letter, a public letter to Mayor O'Dwyer saying, don't give them an official reception. City of New York, don't give them an official reception. He said he's going to have to do it, and that's going to be bad for the image of the Zionist organization. He says, the State Department is going to make him do it. I said, the State Department doesn't vote in New York City elections, you know? Anyway, we didn't agree. When we walked out of the office, he was yelling at us. In the name of the Jewish Agency, in the name of the... Come back to the Beitar office at 55 West 42nd Street. And the girl says to me, Mr. Netanyahu called you. Their office was, I think, on the 9th floor, and we were on the 15th floor. So I put two and two together. You know, by that time, the revisionists were back in the World Zionist Organization, so they were getting money. I walked into Netanyahu's office. I didn't let him say a word. I said, if the revisionist organization wants to disassociate itself from this action, it's okay, but we're going ahead. He didn't say a word. I didn't let him. I have the letters that the other groups sent out informing everybody not to come. We were there. We had 1,500 people there. They weren't all our people, but we had also, rounded up people. And the police wanted to keep us away from the Armory. So they had cops on horseback, and they were pushing us, away from the Armory. And there were some arrests made because there were cops who were injured. And when I got to the police station to try to help get our guys out of there, who do I meet? Paul O'Dwyer, the brother of the mayor, who was a lawyer representing gratis our people. And the mayor did not give the British a an official reception.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, he wasn't the only one. There were other lawyers there who were gratis. They were helping our guys, you know.
And when the vote came around?
At the UN,
Yeah.
what happened is what happened, you know. We had a rally afterwards up in St. Nicholas Arena. No, it wasn't our rally. It was a celebration. And we were there protesting. Partition means the end of Zionism, you know.
Where did you demonstrate? In New York or in
New York. In New York. That was, yeah, up there in, I forget where the St. Nicholas Arena was, in the 50s somewhere. Yeah. You've heard a lot of stories.
Yeah. When did you meet Miriam?
In Beitar. Yeah. I met her when she was 14 years old. I went up to, Miriam came to the U.S. together with Misher and their mother. They left Riga in September 39. And came to New York. Their father was here. He sent for them. He told the mother to leave everything and come. And so she was, when I met her, she was 14. Because it was in Misha's apartment. I met him in his parents' apartment when he was in New York. And then she was active in Beitar. And she was at that camp up there in Lenox, Massachusetts, where we had the Kinos Artsy in 48, yeah.
We'll take a break.
Please.
Okay, a couple more. So, did you ever become? Were you ever the Netziv of Beitar?
No, I didn't. I declined.
Declined. Why?
I had my hands full.
Mhm.
I had serious problems at home. I wasn't lucky in my vocation because, remember I told you I worked for newspapers. I spent several months in Israel in 48, 49, and when I came back, I couldn't get a job. So many papers closed. The Tribune, the New York Herald Tribune, the World Telegram, the Journal American, the Mirror, and some of the wire services and so on. And people were thrown out of work in large numbers. And there's such a thing in the American Newspaper Guild as seniority. You know, I had not worked long enough to be able to be considered for whatever openings there were in the papers that remained. And I was in no position to leave New York. There were jobs elsewhere. But I had to be here because I had my parents who were in bad shape. So there were problems, yeah.
When did you get married?
51.
51.
Yeah. By that time I was, I have to tell you about Sam Wang. When I came back from Israel,
First tell me about, why did you go to Israel? Well, that was your first trip?
yeah,
When?
49 March. I arrived in March. And it was
War of Independence was still going on.
It was the end.
In the end.
It was the end. I think they were still going on in Sinai.
Mhm.
Yeah, in the south. but it was the end.
Why'd you come? Why'd you go to Israel?
I came as a delegate to the Kinos Olamid.
That was your first trip.
Yeah.
How long did you stay?
3 or 4 months. I'm not sure exactly. Well, I left June. Came March, left June.
Call from Kaplan Raven.
That's Ray Kaplan. But I'm not going to take the call now.
Call from Kaplan Raven.
He just lost his wife. And, yeah. I'll call him back, honey. I'll call him back. Misha met Ray at MIT. Ray is a guy whose mother was institutionalized. There were 5 children, and the father couldn't deal with it. So they were in orphanages and foster homes and so on. That's Ray's background in Brooklyn. And he graduated from Brooklyn Technical High School and joined the Navy in the Second World War and was sent up to Dartmouth to be trained, I'm not sure exactly in what. When he was discharged, he went to MIT on the bill of the GI Bill, and Misha met him at MIT, and they became friends, and he joined Beitar. And he became very active in Beitar. And when Misha came to New York after he finished MIT, Ray came with him, and he was active in Beitar here. He was Mefaket HaGalil for the New York area for a while, and then he served under Nitziv Wood. And in the spring of '48, we had a bunch of our kids on the Marine Corps to go to Israel. We had 4, what do you call them, Garinim, that went out at that time. And the Marine Corps was one of the first. It wasn't the first, but it was, the first was the Ben Hecht. The first was the Ben Hecht. And when they set sail, there was no Jewish state, and the last port of call for the Marine Corps was Beirut. Marine Corps was an American export line ship. And when they put in at Beirut, the state already existed, and Lebanon was at war with Israel, and the Lebanese soldiers came up on board to take off all the Jews of military age. There were, I think, 60, maybe 9 American and some Israeli Jews. There were shlichim here from Palestine, Etzel shlichim, on the ship too. And that miserable captain, this was an American ship, you know, and he didn't make a fuss. And the boys were removed from the ship and sent to Baalbek, which was in the hills there, the Baca Valley. The French army camp had been turned into a prison, and that's where these 69 guys were sent. Ray was one of them. We had 2 girls on the ship. Muriel Eisenberg, who is now married to Misha, and Marilyn Schindel, another girl from Boston, by the way. So the girls arrive in Haifa, and they have the luggage of the boys. So Muriel had to arrange, you know, with her relatives. She had relatives. It's a story. You know, the guys on the Altalena who came without clothes because the ship went down with their clothes, they were clothed with the clothes from the guys from the Marine Corps who were up there at Baalbek. You know, the American consul in Beirut was an anti-Semite. He took his time to come up to Baalbek, and when he came up, he was very unfriendly and nasty, in fact. And they were just as nasty to him because they were mad. And then they got he got instructions from Washington that they should arrange with the Lebanese to release them and to bring them back to the United States. In other words, but that didn't apply to the Palestinians, the Shlichim. They wouldn't leave without them, you know. And they had their way. And they were all put on a ship bound for the United States. In Naples, some jumped ship. In the Azores, they ran into another Garin on the Sam Wang, which had engine troubles and put into the Azores. So there were Beit Harim on the Ruth Wang, there were Beit Harim, on the Marine Corps, who met in the harbor at the Azores. Our guys were all over the place. Jack Perlmutter was on a boat, it was a Haganah boat, and it ran out of water, and it ran out of everything, food, while it was off the coast of Crete. He told me that they put him and several others ashore to buy water and to buy food, and they were captured by communist guerrillas because that part of Crete was under communist control. And they were locked up, and nobody could understand Greek. They couldn't communicate with them. They didn't know what the hell. The ship was on there with hundreds of refugees and no food and no water, and they were here with the money in jail. See, until he told me some of the some higher officials, communist officials who could speak English, came, and when they explained everything, they were released. They bought the water, they bought the food, they went back to the ship, and they continued the journey. This was a Haganah ship. It's not one of ours, you know.
I want to ask you one closing question.
Okay.
What do you think it is important for people to remember about the contribution of Americans toward the founding of the state?
I happen to believe that, never mind the bullshit, I happen to believe that we could have done a lot to save Jews in Europe. It's not a battle that we lost. It's a battle that we didn't fight. And that's a fact, in my opinion. And there are various things, various ways, and at various points. I'm not saying that we would do the impossible, but there were things that were possible. They weren't attempted. They weren't attempted, you know. And Raffaelli says that when he came here. But I didn't really know Raffaele because he worked with Bergson, but on the West Coast. He was the guy who raised the money out there in Las Vegas, you know, and I met him in Israel when he was retired already. It was Brodetsky. He told me, I was in a hotel there, and he said, Raffaele is about a block away from you, you know, so we dropped in on him. I'll tell you something else. I was in the office of Bob Abrams, who was borough president of the Bronx in the 60s, waiting to see him. And there was another guy waiting to see him who was a lawyer from the firm of Goldwater and Flynn. Goldwater and Flynn was a powerhouse. Flynn was the Democratic leader in the Bronx. Goldwater was, it's not the Goldwater from Arizona, this is Monroe Goldwater from New York. So when he told me who he was a partner in Goldwater and Flynn. And I said to him, why the hell didn't you guys light a fire under FDR during the Second World War, or before the Second World War? And he was older than I, you know. And he said to me, you don't know how scared we were. That's what he said. You don't know how scared we were. He's an honest man. No excuses, no horseshit. He was scared. That's what Raffaele told me, that they were scared. He said wherever he went, they were scared. They were scared for their own skin. Roosevelt was the savior. They weren't going to do anything to undermine him. You know? That was the problem. You know, that St. Louis was off the coast of Florida for about a week. I found out, you know, we had interviews of survivors of the Holocaust. Ray and I were interviewing them. That was before that guy in Hollywood got involved. It was sponsored by some department store owner here. I met a guy who was on a ship called the Orinoco, another ship full of German Jews who were turned away from Cuba. It turns out there was a whole stream of ships behind them. There was a conference of one of the Rabbinical Assembly or one of those outfits right after the St. Louis was sent away. The subject didn't come up. It wasn't on the agenda.
All right.
Yeah.
Transjordan was empty.
Yeah.
Could have been filled with Jews.
Yeah. Thank you very much. This was really enlightening and interesting, and I appreciate all the time that you gave us.
I'm glad that you gave me the opportunity. I have written articles that were not published. Even in the local Jewish paper. I wrote about the Struma years ago and sent it into the Jewish Standard. And it didn't appear. And I called the editor and I asked if she got it, and she denied that she got it. I said, I'll come over with another copy. And then she found it, you see. And she said it was too long, or so she gave me some excuse. So I went to the guy who was the head of the Federation here, He's a lawyer. He worked with one of the financial publishing houses in Fort Lee, not in Fort, in Englewood Cliffs. And he called her. And another guy from B'nai Yeshurun, from the Orthodox community, he called her. She wouldn't publish it. And that I've had that problem generally, that my stuff, for some reason, is not welcome.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. For a long time. Because Begin sent him here to prepare the way for his visit when he became prime minister. So he was running around the country meeting with the heads of B'nai B'rith.
This is 1977.
Yes.
Yeah.
When Begin was elected. And the only people that he didn't meet was us. And I decided I don't want to have anything to do with him. And I'm so sorry, because I had many opportunities, and he was a good man, and it taught me something. It taught me something. You know, I wish I had known him.
You didn't know him though in 47 or 48?
No.
No.
No, not at that time. Not at that time. But this is a guy who was promised that there would be a